All right, I think we will get started. Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Loudon. I'm the director of the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who is sponsoring this virtual lecture this evening. I'm very, very pleased to welcome our guest speaker. She's Professor Friederike Baer. She is an associate professor of history at Penn State Abington, which is in the greater Philly area. And her research focus is on the American Revolution and the early Republic. She has a special interest in the experiences of German-speaking people in North America between approximately 1775 and 1830. Professor Baer began her university studies in Göttingen, completed a bachelor's degree in history at Boston College, and then earned her MA and PhD in history at Brown. Professor Baer's first book, The Trial of Frederick Eberly, Language, Patriotism, and Citizenship in Philadelphia's German Community, 1790 to 1830, which was published in 2008 with NYU Press, used the 1816 trial of 59 German Americans as a prism through which to explore the notions of citizenship, language, and patriotism in the first 4 decades of the Revolution, after the Revolution. The book was the winner of the St. Paul's Biglerville Prize for the best book in Lutheran Church history, published between 2005 and 2008. Professor Baer's second monograph, and the focus of her presentation this evening, which has the same title, is Hessians, German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War, and was published last year by Oxford University Press. In this book, Professor Baer, as we'll learn this evening also, reimagines Britain's war against American independence from the perspective of the German soldiers who fought on the British side, a people uniquely positioned both in the midst of the war and at its margins. It was the winner of the 2023 Society of the Cincinnati Prize, a major award given annually for an outstanding book that advances our understanding of the American Revolution and its legacy. So again, Professor Baer is going to be speaking for about 50 minutes or so. And we will have plenty of time for Q&A afterward. If you have any questions that come up during her presentation, feel free to put them into the Q&A. And or if you want to wait until the formal presentation is over, you can also enter it there. But at any time, you're welcome to put them into the Q&A, and then I will read them out to Professor Baer, and we'll have a fun discussion. So with that, I'm very, very pleased to welcome you, Friederike, to our first virtual talk of the 2023-24 academic year at the Max Kade Institute. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Mark. I'm very happy to be here. Let me share my presentation. And can you please confirm that you see the full slide? Yes? Does it look good?
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. It's always confusing. I have 2 monitors. So thank you so much for inviting me to present some of my research on the German soldiers in the American Revolutionary War here at in this virtual space of the Max Kade Institute. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And if you're joining us from Germany, guten Abend oder bald guten Morgen. Really happy that you're all here. I would like to say a few general words about who these individuals were, these thousands of troops that we know as Hessians, and how they ended up in North America. And then I will give you a few impressions of the experiences, including, I thought this would be fitting for this presentation tonight, including encounters with German Americans. So a brief introduction. In the 1770s and 1780s, as many as 40,000 German soldiers were hired to defend British imperial interests on 4 continents. In America, of course, in Gibraltar and Minorca, in India, and also in South Africa. The vast majority of these, around 30,000, saw service in America. In August 1776, a popular German periodical called the Deutsche Chronik, or the German Chronicle, noted very optimistically that, quote, soon the English will have to thank the Germans a second time for the conquest of America. The editor here was alluding to William Pitt's famous reference to Germany's role in the 7 Years' War, better known as the French and Indian War in America, about a decade earlier, a war that resulted in France ceding a large portion of its territorial possessions in North America along with several Caribbean islands, to Britain. Early that same year, in 1776, Britain's Prime Minister Lord North predicted that the hire of the German auxiliaries would bring the war to a speedy resolution, as he put it, without the further effusion of blood. Of course, we know that neither of these predictions came true. In fact, one could argue that the steady supply of Germans helped keep the war going for 7 more years. Before I continue, let me emphasize that by around 1780, 1781, in other words, 4 to 5 years into the war, fully 1/3 of the British regular army strength in North America consisted of German auxiliaries. This was obviously not an insignificant presence. It is important also to mention that Britain's employment of foreign soldiers was nothing unusual. Britain fought most of its 17th and all of its major 18th century wars with the help of foreign soldiers. And Britain was not unique in this regard. Other major European powers, such as France, Prussia, Russia, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, also employed foreign troops. In other words, in the 18th century, the typical European army was a multinational force. In addition, what some historians have called the trade in soldiers was an acceptable source of revenue. Rulers rented out soldiers to foreign powers for subsidy payments, and they used the income to support lavish lifestyles, which earned them criticism. For example, for selling their subjects, like, and I quote, cattle to have their throats cut, as the King of Prussia put it in a letter to the French philosopher Voltaire in 1776. But the income was also used as revenue to pay off territorial debt. And in fact, even the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, was not opposed to the practice if that was the main objective. They also used it to fund projects that were designed to benefit the territories generally, such as the construction of villages, roads, hospitals, and the like. The most famous or the best known of these kind of projects is probably the spa in Hanau, Wilhelmsbad. It was built over several years. Construction began in 1777. It was a huge success and became a major, what we would call, tourist destination. Thomas Jefferson himself visited the spa in 1788 in the company of Friedrich Wilhelm von Geismar, a Hanau officer who had befriended him during his stay in Virginia as a prisoner of war. I wonder sometimes how Jefferson may have felt. He admired the impressive structures, the park, that had been built with money paid for soldiers hired to fight against the American revolutionaries. Moreover, subsidy payments should also, or subsidy treaties, I should say, should also be seen as political measures that allowed rulers of smaller territories within the Holy Roman Empire to maintain a certain degree of power and influence, and in some cases preserve their dynastic interests and gain protection from foreign powers. So several of the German rulers that ended up hiring out subjects to King George III were related to him. The hereditary Prince of Braunschweig, for example, who became Duke in 1780, was married to Augusta of Hanover, the king's oldest sister, making the king's brother-in-law. And the Landgraf of Hessen's wife was one of George II's granddaughters, Mary. And finally, these soldiers were not mercenaries, which are soldiers who fight in a foreign army or war for personal profit. These soldiers are more properly named or labeled auxiliaries, military units with their own commanders that were hired out by their respective rulers to assist Britain in its efforts to put down the American rebellion. The German term that was often used is Hilfstruppen, Hilfe meaning help or aid. How did these troops end up in North America? Well, short version, in the spring of 1775, when hostilities broke out in North America, Britain faced a very challenging task, and that was to raise a substantial army that could be dispatched to America quickly. For various reasons, the king decided that he would not be able to raise a sufficient number of men within the British Empire, including North America. after the failure of hiring 20,000 Russians, the king turned to several German states for support, as he had done many times before. And in fact, by the summer of 1775, several of the German rulers had already offered troops to the king. The map here shows, of course, the Holy Roman Empire. I don't think, and remind anyone on this call that Germany did not exist as a nation. The 6 territories that ended up hiring troops, sending troops in the American War, were all part of the Holy Roman Empire that consisted of hundreds of small and large territories. The numbers that I included here on the slide is an estimate of the total number of soldiers that were sent to North America between 1776 and 1783. That includes reinforcement and reemplacement, and then a couple of instances, additional treaties that were signed after 76 and 77. As you can see, the number of soldiers that were sent over varied widely from territory to territory. One thing is obvious, and that is the majority of troops came from Hessen-Kassel and Hessen-Hanau, and that is one reason why all of these German troops have been known as Hessians, regardless of place of origin. That label emerged already during the war. In my book, I should say, it is of course used in the title of my book because it is a recognizable label, but in my book, and tonight too, I'm very careful to only refer to Hessians when I'm actually talking about Hessians, so to speak. When I'm referring to soldiers or civilians from other territories, I'm very clear about either referring to them as German or by the territory that they were from. The first treaties were signed in late 1775. The first troops began their journey to America in February 1776. In other words, some of these territories literally had a few weeks to raise, equip, assemble large numbers of soldiers and send them to America. And I want to say very quickly something just very briefly about these subsidy treaties. They varied somewhat in the details, but they're basically agreed on the general terms. All of these German units would be commanded by their own officers, and they would be subject to their own military law. They're almost always served alongside British troops, and with very rare exceptions, the overall commander was always a British officer. The troops would serve as on the same terms as the British soldiers. They earned the same wages, for example. They could only serve in Europe and North America. Britain paid annual subsidies to their ruler, usually for the duration of the war, a couple of years afterwards, because no one knew in 1776 how long that war would last. Britain also paid for transport to from America, for the individual pay, equipment, provisions, replacements, medical care, and so on. As you can probably imagine, this was an incredibly complicated undertaking. And if you like spreadsheets, the archives in Germany and the United States include quite a few of these kind of records that enumerate the number of individuals that went to America and all the supplies that they required. The troops were also accompanied by hundreds of civilians and employees of the army, including medical personnel, chaplains, servants, and laborers. To the army also belonged a significant number of women, including single women and the wives of soldiers who served in a range of important roles, such as laundresses, maids who were employed in the field hospitals, and last but not least, there were also hundreds of children. The presence of and the role of women and children is not as well documented as one would wish, but they do show up. There are records that shed light on their presence. And here on the slide is an example of a record, a list of troops that were sent to Quebec. This is the third recruiting transport from Braunschweig. And you can see in the left column a list of individuals by role who embarked at Stade, which is a German port, in April of 1779. You can see sort of the variety of roles. Musicians, of course, important. The majority are basically rank and file. and then there are 14 women and 2 children. On this particular record, you also have a column, that's the column in the middle here, that indicates how many of these people had been lost between their departure in Germany in April and their arrival in Quebec in October. In this particular case, just a couple of examples, 1 child had died during the voyage, but another one had been born. So 2 children left Germany, 2 children arrived, but they're not, one of them is not the same child. 1 soldier and his wife were chased away from the army. We don't really know why exactly, it's not explained. 5 individuals died, including the child, and the number of people are listed as sick. The regimental or the company surgeon actually deserted, which is remarkable, I think. So when I look at a record like this, and again, we have lots of these kind of lists, I see stories. Think about these people who are coming to North America, very different backgrounds. I mean, they all happen to be recruited by Braunschweig, but their backgrounds are very different. There's a wide range of experience, expectations, motivations, ages, and so forth. And that's really what I set out to explore when I started my project. I wanted to find out more about these people. Who were they? What was it like for them in North America? So who were they? None of the German rulers simply rented out their entire armies. The potential long-term or even permanent loss of large numbers of young men would not only have hurt the territory economically, but it would obviously have made it vulnerable to foreign threats. In general, and I'm generalizing here, the regiment's hideout for Britain consisted of a combination of experienced soldiers and new recruits, some of whom had probably never fired a gun before leaving for the war in America. I would say that Britain may have expected to get a trained and experienced military force, but this was only partially the case. It was fairly easy to fill the officer ranks. The war presented officers or aspiring officers with an opportunity to advance their careers. All the territories received large numbers of requests from officers as well as ambitious soldiers and veterans asking for appointments in the American Corps. The territories used a variety of conscription schemes to raise the troops, such as enrollment lists or requiring districts to raise a certain number of men. Regardless of the scheme, the territories were essentially looking for the same type of men to fill up the regiments. They had to be physically and mentally fit to withstand a military campaign in North America. Their age was important. Most of the soldiers were in their 20s, but we also have young men who are in their teens and men as old as the 40s and early 50s. There should be at least 5'4" tall, but that was also relaxed as the war went on and it became harder and harder to recruit the necessary number of men. And ideally, they were single, or if married without children. In other words, the fewer dependents, the better. Here's an example of a printed recruiting certificate for a man who joined the Braunschweig Corps. All of the territories issued orders that only volunteers were supposed to sign up. This, as we, I think, know, did not necessarily happen. There is plenty of evidence that there were men that were sent to America who did not volunteer for service, and I have an example in a minute. In this particular case, I just want to highlight this man, Johann Friedrich Hennig, received 5 Thaler in a bounty, which was quite generous. The servants' wages, just for context, at the time were maybe 1.5 Thaler a month. So 5 Thaler is a pretty attractive incentive for young men to enlist. I also want to point out the date of this certificate, 1782. We, I think, tend to forget that the war really did go on, started in 75 and ended in 1783. And the recruitment of German soldiers continued pretty much almost until the end of the war. It did not cease with the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. That's often considered sort of the end of the Revolutionary War. This man was recruited in early 1782. We have recruiting transports of thousands of German soldiers who left Germany for North America over the course of that year, 1782. So important, I think, to keep in mind. All of the territories used various exemptions that were designed to exclude certain men from military service. These men were supposed to stay at home. This included the only sons, for example, property owners or young men who were expected to inherit property at some point, laborers in essential industries like mines, university students. These individuals were not supposed to go into service in America. Generally, recruiters were supposed to enlist foreigners or native men deemed expendable. Men, in other words, whose departure for America was regarded as having little or no economic disadvantages for the territory, or whose absence may have even been seen as beneficial for the local community. And I just want to give you an example. In early 1782, the mother of 24-year-old Georg Christian Vogt pleaded with Hanau's ruler to enlist her son in the Freikorps that was scheduled to go to America that spring. She was a poor widow, and he, she said, was a violent man who had attacked her with an axe. He had been enraged after she forbid him to carry off some items that belonged to her children. Two soldiers passing by her house had heard a commotion and intervened. It turns out that Georg had also stolen tobacco from a local field and burglarized several homes. He often, neighbors reported, came home drunk and wandered around the attic with a burning candle. They were very worried that at some point he will burn down the neighborhood. The mother described him as a Taugenichts, a good for nothing, who had already received all sorts of punishments without improving his ways. Sending him to America would not only help her, but it would also straighten him out and benefit the community. Georg rejected all of these charges. He admitted that he had been angry, but he said he had never intended to hit or kill her. She called him a Taugenichts, good for nothing. He responded in a hearing by calling her a Seelenverkäufer, or a seller of souls. Long story short, Georg was ordered to go with the Freikorps to America. A unit, I should mention, that had a very bad reputation overall, maybe partly because it recruited men like Georg. Its commanding officer was involved in a pretty extensive smuggling operation where Hanau produced bijouterie, which is basically trinkets, including snuff boxes, were sold on the American market in violation of the British Navigation Acts. In any case, of course, ideally, men volunteered. Thick files, however, in German archives document cases of young men who refused to report for mustering, potential recruits who escaped into foreign territories, recruits who deserted or mutinied, and families who pleaded with their ruler to exempt husbands and sons for a variety of reasons, most often because they faced economic hardship. The main objection by the men seems to have been the prospect of serving in a foreign war on a distant continent against an enemy that had done them no harm. As mentioned earlier, Britain had hired German auxiliaries before on multiple occasions, but this was new. They had never served outside of Europe. So sending them to another continent, that was what made it very difficult. The prospect of going to America made it difficult for local officials to enlist suitable men. Not surprisingly, however, there were also many reasons why young men from the Holy Roman Empire may have volunteered for service in America. Recruits went willingly or volunteered for an opportunity to improve their economic situation, gain free passage to America, advance their military career, study the American land and people, or in search of adventure. 22-year-old recruit Stefan Popp from Ansbach-Bayreuth recorded in his journal that many of the recruits around him were, quote, filled with grief and sorrow, while I and those in my way of thinking were enjoying the prospect of leaving our mother country for the new world. A few of the men were actually explorers or scientists who recorded their observations about the American land and people in letters and journals. They studied fossils, collected cultural objects, and natural specimens. They did so privately and also per their ruler's request. In 1779, for example, General Wilhelm von Knyphausen, the commander of the Hessian Corps, directed all Hessian regiments on behalf of the Landgraf to collect rarities such as Native American clothing and artifacts, and he ordered the quartermasters to maintain journals that detailed each and every event pertaining to their regiments. The receipt in the archives in Kassel indicates that Knyphausen himself brought back a sugar cane and a pouch with crystals for Georg Forster, the famous geographer, naturalist, writer, and at the time professor in Kassel, probably best known as a participant in James Cook's voyage to the Pacific in the early 1770s. For my book project, I relied heavily on these kinds of records, German authors' private and public records that I think offer a new perspective of the American War. Over the course of several years, I conducted research in around 24 archives in Europe and the United States. And on the slides are just some representative examples, a regimental journal by the Regiment von Boses in the center, an embarkation list, a published journal, a journal that was published during the war for German speakers in Europe, baptismal records, maps, private letters. In all, these letters, in addition to objects, help broaden the knowledge of North America among German-speaking Europeans in the late 18th century. And they certainly broaden our own understanding of the American land and the people and the war during this pivotal moment in American history. I would say that the perspective of these participants, observers, is unlike any other group of people that took part in this war. They are both in the midst of it, but they're also at its margin. We tend to reduce the Hessians to their participation at Trenton in December 1706, maybe Saratoga in October 1707, possibly Yorktown in the fall of 1783. All of these are major American victories, turning points, some say, and they are obviously very important. All of them also resulted in the capture of thousands of German soldiers. But it is important to remember that the vast majority of German troops did not take part in any of these battles. Just as a quick reminder of the major campaigns of the Revolutionary War, Germans took part in all of these campaigns and many of the minor skirmishes that took part all across North America, at least along the eastern seaboard. In fact, between the summer of 76, when the first contingent set foot on American soil, and 1783, when the British Army evacuated the newly founded United States, members of the German Corps spent extended periods of time in locations as dispersed and varied as Quebec and Nova Scotia in the north, and West Florida and Jamaica in the south. Across this vast terrain, they participated, as I mentioned, in all major military campaigns and many less momentous encounters. Some never saw battle. They spent their entire time in North America somewhere in garrison. Thousands died of disease, were killed in battle, or were captured by the enemy. Over the course of the war, a growing number also deserted. The German troops had to get used to fighting in an unfamiliar terrain, along soldiers and under commanders, and against an enemy that they did not necessarily understand. Major Karl Leopold Bauermeister of the Hanau Corps captured the sense of frustration in the very first entry of his journal. It was, quote, twice the work, he noted, to fight a war with an incomprehensible friend and rebellious enemy. The first transports carrying German troops arrived in the summer of 1776 in Canada and in New York. What were their impressions of the land? I want to focus on the impressions of New York. That's where the two major divisions of Hessians landed in the summer and fall of '76. Many Germans recorded detailed descriptions of New York, of the New York region in their diaries and letters. Their view of what they initially saw as representing all of America was very favorable. The Americans appeared to be enjoying a very high standard of living. An ordinary Long Island farmer appeared to be living as well as an aristocrat in Hessen. Indeed, one officer explained, if one put an American farmhouse next to the house of a noble family in Hessen, it would be very challenging to distinguish one from the other. One reason for this prosperity was the richness of the land itself. The Germans described the landscape, including the farmland, as exceptionally abundant and fertile. The land was pleasant with rolling hills, lush forests, fresh springs. There was an abundance of wheat, corn, and other grains, and there was also plenty of orchards, chestnuts, peaches, cherries, apples, pears, plums, apricots, you name it. The livestock was well nourished, farms neatly kept. Long Island was described as the garden of all of North America. The Germans' impressions of New York City was very positive as well. They admired its wide streets, beautiful churches, and stately college. Remember also that in 1776, that first campaign started off quite well for the British. One of the highlights of the fall was the conquest of Fort Washington, and here's a rendering of that conquest, which was renamed Fort Kniphausen after the Hessian commander. At that time, German officers were very confident that the war would be over in no time and that they would be victorious. Indeed, initially, the German soldiers did not have very much respect for the Americans as they were the enemy. Of course, as I mentioned, many of the German soldiers were young men who had been recruited specifically for the war in America. They were not necessarily more experienced in warfare than their American counterparts. Certainly, most of them had never participated in a battle before. However, from the perspective of someone belonging to a highly hierarchical and disciplined army that stressed the neat and orderly appearance of all its members, from private to general, the Americans didn't even look like soldiers. For example, German soldiers were either clean-shaven or they wore neatly groomed mustaches. Many of the Americans were unshaven, or were described as unshaven, thus giving the appearances of Spitzbuben or scoundrels rather than soldiers. Shortly after his arrival in Long Island, a Hessian wrote in a letter to Kassel that he did not have a razor. He was very embarrassed that at times he had a beard like a rebel. Moreover, German troops, well uniformed at least in the early phase of the war, found that many Americans were dressed in torn rags of different colors, or the miserable outfits typically worn by poor farmers. For the most part, moreover, they found that the American soldiers were undisciplined and lacked loyalty. They were cowards who ran at the first sight of the enemy. From the Germans' perspective, Washington's retreats, his refusal to meet the British in a large-scale battle, were not based on strategic decisions, rather they were due to the spinelessness of his soldiers. One Hessian chaplain observed that the Hessians were charging after the, and I quote, countless bands of gypsies, as he described the American troops. And at the Battle of Harlem Heights in the fall of 1776, the American Colonel Joseph Reed was enraged that when British and Hessians, and I quote, sounded their bugles in the most insulting manner, as is usual after a fox chase. In general, then, at least in the first couple of campaigns, the Germans regarded the Americans as an inexperienced, undisciplined, and poorly equipped enemy they were chasing most of the time. As one officer put it, it was very fortunate that they were fighting against a nation that was unfamiliar with real warfare. It took the Germans a while to abandon their conceived notion and of a proper appearance and behavior of an army. Indeed, the Germans realized early on that this American war was unlike any other military conflict that they had known. First, of course, there was the terrain and the climate. The troops in Canada, for example, had to learn how to row boats, the bateau, and march in snowshoes. In a letter from Quebec to his brother in Braunschweig, dated May 1781, Lieutenant Auguste Duroy wrote that every soldier had gotten used to wearing snowshoes. He wrote to his brother, "We always have around 50 Indians with us on patrol, and the German soldiers are racing on snowshoes with the best of them. I wish you could see them marching like this. You would be filled with admiration for your countrymen." The terrain and climate in places such as West Florida and Georgia required, of course, different kinds of adjustments, such as dealing with the heat and the humidity and the mosquitoes. Regardless of location, German troops frequently complained about physically exhausting marches and inclement weather that they were not used to and that rendered campaigning exceptionally challenging. Second, they had to get used to an American way of fighting. For example, they had trouble distinguishing between friend and foe, and the distinction between a civilian and combatants, as we would call them today, was generally unclear. Moreover, the Americans tended to fight in what the Germans described as very unconventional ways. Americans did not invent these ways, but they practiced them. This included the strategy of ambushing an unsuspecting enemy. In 1777, a private wrote to his parents in Hessen that the Americans were not like regular soldiers, but rather, quote, "more like robbers and thieves, in that they hide in hedges and bushes and shoot so well that they hit, that when they are able, that they hit every time." Although this behavior was seen as dishonorable and unacceptable, it also rendered these fighters into effective opponents. German troops had to get used to this type of irregular warfare carried out by what they saw as a ragtag bunch of farmers. They had to learn how to protect themselves from ambushes and also how to conduct them. This is one reason why Jäger, literally huntsman or woodsman, became so useful in this war. After his return to Germany, the Hessian Jäger, Johann Ewald, wrote a couple of military manuals about the small war or irregular warfare, in which he relied heavily on his experience in America. These manuals ultimately influenced 19th century European warfare and were used in British officer training. Of course, for the Hessians, as we know, the year 1776 ended with a humiliating defeat at Trenton. This unfortunate affair resulted in the capture of around 1,000 Hessian soldiers, women, children, and other attached civilians. Here's a map, a rendering completed by an officer, Andreas Wiederhold, who was there. He was at post, which I circled in red on this map. He writes in his journal that he was basically having his morning coffee. He was walking around the guardhouse. He looked towards the woods, and he saw the Americans come out of the woods, attacking the garrison at Trenton on Christmas in 1776. Trenton was an important turning point. It was a morale booster for the American forces. The troops were commanded by Washington, obviously, after the courageous crossing of the Delaware. It's a famous story. I don't want to go into details here. I do want to mention that Trenton did not radically change the Germans' perceptions of the Americans, but Trenton had a major impact on the Americans' image of the Germans. And that image, from the beginning, had been ambivalent. On the one hand, the Americans viewed German soldiers as a ruthless mercenary, a plunderer, a savage, not unlike Native Americans. They were brutal towards both the enemy soldiers and worse, innocent civilians, including women and children. This image prevailed during the summer and fall of 1776, as the Patriots tried to motivate American men to join the rebellion and defend their communities, their homes, and their families from these invaders. The Hessians here was depicted as violent and merciless, and I think this image prevails to this day. On the other hand, the German soldiers were also depicted as the poor victims of tyranny, forced by greedy princes to fight in a war that did not concern them. They were deserving of pity. Based on the assumption that these soldiers had been enlisted against their will and that they lacked loyalty to the British cause, the Americans believed that they would gladly lay down their weapons and settle in America if given the chance. The Patriots began to publish offers of land, livestock, and liberty to Germans who abandoned their colors already in the summer of 1776. The capture of as many as 1,000 Hessians at Trenton reinforced the image of them as innocent victims, and the Patriots actively cultivated this particular image over the next few years. Moreover, the Trenton prisoners were literally a captive audience, which the Americans could entice to desert, and they certainly tried. One way to entice them was to expose them to Germans who had settled in North America and grown prosperous. As many as 100,000 German-speaking people had left Europe before the American Revolution and settled in British North America. Members of the German Corps encountered some of these German or German Americans in most of these places that they visited or they went, from Canada to Jamaica. Not surprisingly, of course, most of these encounters took place in Pennsylvania and Maryland, but also in New York, Virginia, and Georgia. They encountered them during military campaigns, and the most important military campaign in this regard was the campaign that ended with the British occupation of Philadelphia. In July of 1777, more than 15,000 British and German troops, along with officers, staff, and servants under the command of General William Howe, had boarded transport in Staten Island that would take them south. An estimated 4,500 or so, roughly 1/3 of the Corps, were German. In late August, the army landed in Maryland, from where they marched north towards Philadelphia. On September 25th, the Corps reached Germantown, a village located just north of the city. The following day, a force consisting of British and Hessian soldiers marched into Philadelphia, and they would remain there until June of 78. Some of the German officers may have thought, perhaps naively, that the German inhabitants that they encountered in these regions would view them with at least some degree of sympathy, on the grounds that they shared certain customs and manners, including, of course, the language. This was not the case. In fact, none of the German authored accounts of the Philadelphia campaign point to German inhabitants as particularly friendly. For obvious reasons, German Americans appear to be angry that fellow Germans had joined the war that brought destruction to their country, regardless of their political sentiments. Even Native Americans, Lutheran pastor Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, who resided in Trapped, but roughly 30 miles from Philadelphia, wrote in his diary, were astonished that it had been taken to America to kill otherwise peaceful inhabitants, including women and children, who had done them no harm. On occasion, German Americans directly challenged German soldiers about their motives for participating in the war against the colonists. For example, the Hessian Jäger Johann Ewald, who I mentioned earlier, recorded in his diary that an elderly German-American woman asked him in German what harm the Americans had done to the Germans, that they would come to America, and whether they would continue in Pennsylvania the murderous burning that they had done in New York and New Jersey. The woman not only shared the popular image of the Germans as brutal invaders, but she also resented their participation in a war that did not concern them. Taken aback by the woman's angry reception, it is perhaps not surprising that Eva described Germans in Pennsylvania generally as, and I quote, the most ill-natured people in the world. Indeed, this critical view was not uncommon. Another Hessian officer, August Eberhard von Dinklage, noted in his diary that the German settlers had brought with them their worst habits, and moreover tended to follow the example of their English neighbors, and that others worked for them as soon as they had become prosperous. They may have started as diligent and hard-working settlers. However, they were quickly corrupted by their environment, including, most importantly, quote, the great liberty to act and live as one desires. This great liberty was largely due to the great variety of religious denominations which these officers believed contributed to a general lack of morals. The Ansbach Captain Heinrich Karl Philipp von Feilich, who also took part in the occupation of Philadelphia, thought that most inhabitants did not believe in much and acted accordingly. It was a common observation among the German troops. Too much freedom, too much leisure had corrupted the American people, including even Germans. The officer's critical view of German Americans as ill-natured certainly also reflected class distinctions, as well as certain assumptions about rural folk. The majority of Germans who had settled in Pennsylvania came from low or middling socioeconomic backgrounds. In general, German officers thought that these colonists were not particularly virtuous and respectable. On the contrary, Andreas Wiederholt claimed that the majority, quote, were of the lowest kind and the refuse of the German nation, that remained raw and unpolished farmers, despite their efforts to imitate their English neighbors. They had absorbed, as he put it, the American spirit of liberty, but were too ignorant to understand what that actually meant. This stupidity rendered them worse than all other Americans. Feilich, the other officer, may have put it most bluntly, quote, the nation consists mostly of those from our fatherland who were driven out for being too lazy to work, to escape the gallows, or by another misfortune. Harsh words. The rank and file may have been less likely to view locals with this degree of condescension exhibited by their superiors, largely because they themselves came from humble socioeconomic backgrounds for the most part. However, the German common soldier who marched through the province as a member of the mighty British Army would probably also have viewed German American rural folk in particular with a certain degree of disdain. I think it is safe to say that in general, soldiers on campaign and local Germans seem to have approached each other with a strong sense of suspicion. Despite the fact that the American soldiers viewed German Americans with suspicion, they very much appreciated the German character of their communities. In fact, even Andreas Wiederholt, who had such a low opinion of German Americans, welcomed the availability of beer and food that was prepared in the German manner. He agreed that their settlements were particularly well developed and maintained. This included towns like Reading and Lancaster, where many Germans spent time as captives, as well as Philadelphia and Germantown, the community northwest of the city, where main army was encamped during the occupation. German officers' impression of the latter two were particularly favorable, especially in contrast to the rural regions of the province. The officer Hinrich explains, quote, there is no nation living in this good world, embracing such a hodgepodge of civilization and semi-barbarism, and wherein is found side by side such learning and stupidity, virtue and vice, shortcomings and accomplishments as are to be found among the Pennsylvanians. Germantown, as many of you I'm sure know, had been founded by a handful of German families in 1683. In the 1770s, it essentially consisted of a 3-mile-long road that was flanked by a number of large stone buildings. It's Germantown Avenue, if you know the area. It was small but attractive. Most of the inhabitants spoke German. There was even a German language newspaper. From October 77 to June 78, the Germantown-based printers Christopher and Peter Sauer published the Pennsylvania Staatskurier, a loyalist weekly. German soldiers read it, and they used it like their hometown paper during their stay in the region. We don't know who, but one German soldier actually sent a May 1778 issue of the Pennsylvania Staatskurier to Germany, where it was published in August Ludwig Schlözer's Briefwechsel that same year. Obviously, Schlözer thought that would be interesting to his German readers. Here's a copy of an image of two of the pages from the Briefwechsel. And what I thought was quite remarkable, that there is actually an advertisement in there by an Ansbach officer who is looking for a servant who can dress hair. In quaint Germantown, one Hessian officer wrote in his diary, he almost felt like being back in Germany. Most members of the German Corps who encountered German Americans did not do so on campaign, but as American prisoners of war. Captivity was a very common experience for members of the German Corps. Many of them spent considerable periods of time in captivity in locations from Massachusetts to Virginia and even Spanish Louisiana and Cuba. Over the course of the war, we estimate that at least 6,000 German soldiers were captured on 5 occasions alone. They include Trenton, 76, that I already mentioned, Bennington, 77, that was shortly before Saratoga, also in 77, capture of 2 vessels off the coast of New York in 79, and then finally Yorktown in the fall of 1781. Thousands of these prisoners, German prisoners, spent periods, some of them many years in captivity. Many of them were moved to predominantly German-speaking regions, including Lancaster and Reading, but also Maryland and Virginia. I'll actually put that map up real quick again. Keeping German captives in these locations was not accidental. These regions were thought to be suited to support large numbers of prisoners of war with food and supplies, including agricultural products. They were also sufficiently removed from theaters of war, which reduced the possibility of liberation, although, of course, the changing theater of war meant that the captives were moved around. Many of these regions were predominantly German-speaking. And that, I think, is an important point. The arrival of prisoners of war in these regions, in these communities, was intended by the Americans to impose a certain degree of military control over areas and communities with questionable allegiance to the American cause. Remember, with prisoners come guards, comes the military, come regulations. But in addition, the removal of German prisoners of war into German-speaking regions was also meant to encourage desertion. Generally speaking, the Americans treated German prisoners of war fairly well. In most cases, they were allowed to hire themselves out to local farms and businesses, and they often experienced relatively little or relatively few restrictions on their movement. Here's a receipt where Hessians were paid for their labor on public buildings in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in August of 77. Based on the assumption that these individuals lacked loyalty to the British cause, desertion was actively encouraged, and the American Congress offered incentives such as liberty and property to German soldiers, as I mentioned already, who left their units and settled in America. And they've often targeted prisoners of war specifically. Initially, these efforts were not as successful as the Americans had expected. However, at least some soldiers that endured long periods of captivity, who worked for local employees, and who forged relationships with inhabitants, including German American women, were tempted to desert. And over the course of the war, a growing number certainly took that step. For the first few years, recruitment into the American military was not officially sanctioned by Congress and the Board of War. That changed after the victory at Yorktown in the fall of 1701. Beginning in 1782, German captives were given the choice of paying a ransom, indenturing themselves, or enlisting in the American army. Here's an example of a list of Braunschweig soldiers who decided to take that step to enlist in the American army, in this case in Pennsylvania line and in the Moses Hessian's regiment that he had formed in Canada. I want to wrap up here. There's lots more stories I could tell, but I know I think out of time. In the end, the vast majority of the members of the German Corps, the soldiers that survived, returned home. This is a chart. The numbers are based on the 19th century studies. I think they're still considered to be the most reliable numbers that we have. What you see here is, first of all, 17,000 or so of the survivors went back to Germany. You also see that the major cause of death was not combat, but it was primarily disease, which was common for 18th century warfare. And then the number, roughly 5,000 or so, who settled in North America. I want to point out that at least half of them, probably more than half of them, actually ended up in Canada. Britain offered land grants to members of the army who decided to settle permanently in regions like Quebec and Nova Scotia, and a good number of German soldiers took advantage of these kind of opportunities. So what do we learn from this? Why do we care? Why should we care? I think that these kind of stories do offer fresh perspectives of the war and the land and the people. I think that they tend to pull in regions into the war and into the conflict that we tend to overlook, including Canada, for example, and West Florida. I didn't talk about West Florida today, but one regiment served in West Florida with devastating consequences. These soldiers often also describe the land in great detail. They describe institutions like slavery in great detail. They comment on Native American customs and manners, not to mention American cities and regions throughout along the East Coast. So I think that their perspectives allow us to broaden our understanding of the war, and last but not least, also appreciate that this was a very violent conflict. As one Hessian officer put it, it was a war that went against all humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Friederike, for a fascinating talk. And we have about 15 minutes for questions, and it's quite likely that we'll have more questions than we'll be able to have time to address. Be reassured that we will do our best to write down those questions and pass them on to Professor Baer afterward. So I'm going to start things off with a question of my own, Friederike. My work is my own area is in the German heritage of Pennsylvania, and specifically Pennsylvania Dutch. And there's a very, very beautiful, lengthy poem called Hessian that was written by Pennsylvania Dutch poet who was born in 1822 named Henry Lee Fisher. And this refers to what is known today as Camp Security. Camp Security apparently is the only undeveloped former Revolutionary prisoner of war camp, and it's located in York County. And it was heavily populated by Hessians who were taken captive after Trenton. And there was a local legend, I don't know how familiar it is today, but it's talked about in this poem, which was written. Fisher was born in 1822. This was published in the 1890s. It was almost certainly written somewhat earlier, but he's telling basically the folklore of an earlier time, that on Christmas Day, the ghosts of the Hessian soldiers come out and sort of haunt what's known as the Hessedal, the Hessian Valley. I've driven past there. It's a really, really beautiful place, and it's, as I say, it's a completely undeveloped so far piece of land in York County. with a lot of lore behind it. Are you familiar with that at all? Is that
I'm
familiar?
not familiar with it,
Okay.
no.
Okay. I'll share that with you.
Yes, please
So,
do. I have
okay.
visited other barracks. There are barracks in Maryland that are still standing. But I've not been to the ones or seen the ones in York County that you mentioned.
Yeah. Oh, happy to share it. All right. I'll go through some of the questions that we have. I'm very grateful for these. So first off, from Chris Behrens, a general question which may be answered during the presentation, and I think you did address it a little bit. Did the Hessians use British tactics, or did they rely on their military training learned on the continent?
That's a good question. I think that there's a mix. As I mentioned, there were quite a few soldiers that had very little military training under their belt. They start exercising them as soon as they're recruited, and then they will continue exercising them when they are after their arrival. And that meant that they would adapt right away to the environment and the climate and the terrain. So, for example, the Braunschweig troops that went to Canada were exercised right away in tactics that were clearly not continental, but they were adapted to the American war and in this case, the Canadian landscape. So I think it is a combination of tactics that were employed.
Interesting. Another question also from Chris. Were payments made to the families left behind during the deployments?
That's a really great question, and I talk about this in some detail in my book. So the soldiers, of course, were paid, and as I mentioned, their wages were equal to British pay, which was generous by the German standards. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. So many soldiers arranged for a portion of their pay to be dispersed to family members back home. So that was very common. And we have ledgers that record what these soldiers had basically taken from their pay and given to their family, or in some cases, they send it back home in the mail, basically. The families, this was, I think, also an incentive for men to enlist, but it was also meant to alleviate economic hardship. Families usually got a range of benefits that could be rent money or firewood or tuition, perhaps for educating the children, or some kind of tax breaks. So there were provisions made for families, including especially wives with children or elderly parents that were supposed to support them during the absence of the husband or son or brother.
Interesting. A couple of questions deal with the question of desertion.
Yeah.
And so where did these deserters go? Were they, you talked about the sort of cultural difference between sort of the older German American immigrant population, especially in Pennsylvania, and the sort of lack of mutual affinity for one another. But do you have a sense of, was there a particular place or area where deserters headed toward? Stayed in Canada, maybe?
I think that generally, and it's not surprising that people who left the army tended to go into areas that were German American, that were where they could expect to meet people that they could literally talk with, and that there was a sense of familiarity, perhaps. They also tended to go or stay in communities where they had been in captivity for extended periods of time, where they'd literally kind of settled in, and as I said, worked and lived with locals. So in terms of region, most of these people they're probably concentrated in areas like Pennsylvania, I think Maryland, Quebec. There are thousands of Germans who spent the entire war in Quebec, and it's not surprising that several hundreds of them, they just decide not to go back to Germany when the war is over, so they would be staying in that region.
Interesting. Yogi Ratman asks, talking about folks from Braunschweig, any indication that some of the soldiers spoke Plattdeutsch, Low German? Other than most people from that region probably did at that time.
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, once in a while, so I should mention that, you know, we have so many records, we have so many diaries and letters and this and that. The vast majority, not surprisingly, was created by officers or by civilian members of the corps, like chaplains, for example. And so we have only a few, we have a couple of diaries by private, very few letters. And sometimes in those records, you get a sense that they had a dialect because they're spelling phonetically. But beyond that, it would be very hard to find solid evidence besides what we know, Mark, about how people talk back then generally.
Great, thank you. Interesting question here from Eric Bright. Was there a difference between American Northerners and Southerners' perceptions in the stereotype of lazy Hessian soldiers versus ravaging invaders? As you say, many German-American Pennsylvanians seem to have held the latter view.
I think, so the question is about how Americans viewed the Germans?
So Northerners versus Southerners,
Yeah.
whether there was maybe a North and South difference there.
I mean, yes, but I think it's partly also because, not necessarily because Northerners have different views than Southerners per se, but because of the progression of the war. So when the first major divisions of the Hessians arrive again in New York in 76, and the fall campaign of 76, that's when that image of the brutal Hessian is really emphasized. And there are stories of atrocities and plundering and so forth. There's no doubt about it. And then Trenton happens, and then by 78, Trenton happens. Then the next fall, Saratoga happens, another major American victory. And then in 78, the war begins to move south, and the Southern campaign starts. So by that time, I think the whole image of the enemy, the German enemy, has altered somewhat. The Americans may have started out with, this is a horribly brutal, invader. By 78, when these troops are going south, that image is already beginning to change, and the Germans are no longer necessarily seen as quite as violent as they had been seen in the beginning of the war. So I think there are changing perceptions, but I think it has more to do with the timing of these campaigns and what has happened between 76 and 78 and 79.
It's an interesting question here from Katya Mai. Any indication about, in the journals or the diaries, about the Hessians' reactions to slavery?
Oh yes, that's a great question. I just didn't have time. You see this nice image here that I chose as my last slide, a black drummer. So the Germans described the institution of slavery in quite thoroughly, and they also comment and describe their encounters with Black men, women, and children over the course of the war free and enslaved. We can say that there are across the board extremely critical of the institution of slavery. It's not always clear to what extent they fully understand slavery as an institution and what it entails, but what they do describe and what they do see is that Black men, Black women, men, and children are treated badly by whites. They're exploited, they're treated brutally, and obviously enslaved. And in fact, some Germans believe that the prosperity in America of white Americans is due because there are enslaving Black people who do all the work for them. So there's a significant degree of sympathy for people that are abused. One chaplain at some point, he writes a letter to Germany, if there was a people in America that should be fighting for their freedom, it would be Black people. He definitely makes this distinction. That being said, the idea that society is very hierarchical, the idea that there are people in power and people that are dependent, that, for want of a better word, that there are masters and servants, that idea is not foreign to these Germans, and they are quite comfortable with that. It's not so much the fact that there are people that are servants to others or dependent on others that's offensive. It's mostly how they are treated by whites that they object to.
Very interesting. Here's a question from John Baltz, a historian here at Madison. It says, thank you for a terrific presentation. I have a question about the relationship between Hesse-Hanau and the United States. Did rank-and-file Hessian foot soldiers who returned to Germany influence Hesse-Hanau's history with regard to subjects like liberty, liberalism, immigration, or political culture? Is there a legacy of the American Revolution on Hesse-Hanau?
That's a really good question. I think we could probably ask this question for all of the territories. You know, we have what 17,000 people go back telling stories about what they found in their communities, presumably. They're often referred to as die Amerikaner back home. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, what the long-term effects of this was. I am not sure that they brought back ideas of liberty and sort of that they were inspired to rebel or anything like that. I think generally these Germans find the idea that subjects would rise up against what they felt an indulgent king under whose watch they had grown very prosperous. I think most of them would find that wrong and in violation almost of some kind of oath of loyalty that they had sworn to their ruler.
Interesting.
It's a very good question. I think that could definitely benefit from additional study.
Yeah. We're getting very close to having to wrap up, but I wanted to kind of consolidate a couple of questions here. So there's questions, I think, if I understand them correctly, about the descendants, so like family history. Are there like Ancestry.com, are there family historical genealogical records about descendants of Hessian soldiers, Hessian deserters, anything like that? One person mentions that the late U.S. Senator from Indiana, Richard Lugar, claimed he was descended from a Hessian deserter.
Oh. I know that the actor Rob Lowe is a descendant of a Hessian who was captured at Trenton. I would refer anyone who's interested in that. I would refer you to the check out the Johannes Schwalm Historical Association. That was founded about 50 years ago. They've started the family started essentially researching their own ancestor as they come out with an annual journal in which they publish sources, translations of records related to German troops, but also often genealogy or people that have researched their ancestors. There are a lot of people out there who are very interested in this kind of research and have done an amazing job looking for the needle in the haystack sometimes. It's not easy, but there are resources available. So Johannes Schwalm Historical Association, Google it, get in touch with them. They're an incredible group of people that would, I think, be very happy to point you in the right direction.
Fantastic. That's a great way to wrap up for our presentation this evening, giving folks some references to other resources. Also notice that Professor Baer has a personal website where there's a lot of really cool links there too related to the topic and other topics that she works on. Friederike, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm very, very grateful for your presentation. And thanks everybody for joining us this evening. And we look forward to seeing you again at future Max Kade Institute virtual lectures. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mark. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Glad to have you.